So for 9 weeks now, 9 weeks ago, I began talking with you and sharing with you about the topic of our following Jesus in a radical way. John, I appreciate in your prayer this morning mentioning that great passage that Jesus, we looked at it last Sunday morning where Jesus said, if any man come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. And so we've been talking about it, and even on Wednesday nights and on Sunday nights, we've been working through David Platt's book called Radical. And our whole goal was simply to just challenge us with regard to our following Jesus and to look at it. And part of my reason behind that was just understanding how easy it is for you and me to allow what we call following Jesus to become casual. Would you agree with that? So when you compare what Jesus said about following him, and then we take and begin to examine our own following, does it match up? You know, is it the same? Could we say that what Jesus said and what we are doing is in line with each other? And so the whole purpose was, so let's take a look at that. And some of you have been working through the study of Radical with us, and in the process of that, we have been making that assessment. We've been examining that. But the reality is, we all have to look at that. We all are challenged with looking at and examining where we stand and what we call our own following of Jesus. And so what I want to do today is I want to challenge you in that. And I want every one of us in this room to just look at our hearts and to take, if we call ourselves a follower of Jesus and we're following him, then what does that look like? Are there changes that need to be made? Are there adjustments in our lives that need to be made? And are we willing to make that change? Are we willing to bring that about in order that when we're following him, we're doing it in a way that is actually radical? I find it interesting that, and I've said this before, that when Jesus talked about following him, what he gave was just what was usual, what was normal, what was expected. We look at what Jesus said and we say, man, that's radical. That's extreme. But the fact is, that's his expectation of us. Deny ourselves, take up our cross daily, and follow him. And so then we use that as a guide. Well, this morning, I want you to turn, if you will, to Luke chapter 5. And I want to look at an example in the life of a follower of Jesus. And I want to look at how Peter followed Jesus in a radical way. And there are 3 details in this experience in Peter's life that I think are things that we can use in our own lives as a gauge, as a measure, as a standard, to evaluate where we stand in our own following of Jesus. I mean, would you agree? Would you agree that it is a healthy thing to examine our hearts and to examine ourselves with regard to following him? And to look at that closely? I think so. And it's not saying that we're not following him or that our following him is wrong. It's just to make sure that we are in our being his followers, that we're doing it in a way that is in line with him. And what I find in this passage is his words to Peter and the experience that Peter went through, that the 3 things that I want to show you from this are things that we can use in our own lives. Look at, if you will, Luke chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. And so Luke records he said, "Now it happened that while the crowd was pressing around him and listening to the word of God, that he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret. And he saw two boats lying at the edge of the lake, but the fishermen had gotten out of them and were washing their nets. And he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little way from the land. And he sat down and he began to teach the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, 'Put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch.' Simon answered him, 'Master, we worked hard all night and caught nothing. But I will do as you say and let down the nets.' And when they had done this, they enclosed a great quantity of fish, and their nets began to break. So they signaled to their partners in the other boats for them to come and to help them. And they came and filled both of the boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw that, he fell down at Jesus' feet, saying, 'Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man, O Lord.' For amazement had seized him and all his companions because of the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, 'Do not fear, for from now on you will be catching men.' And when they had brought their boats to the land, they left everything and they followed him." And when I look at this, what I see within this text is I see Peter radically following Jesus. And there are three details from his experience that we need to look at and we need to apply in our lives. The first one is found in verse 5. When Jesus had got into his boat, Peter's boat, and had taught the multitudes, and then he told Peter, he said, "Now put out into the deep water and let down your nets." And Peter said, "We have fished all night and we have caught nothing." And you got to remember that Jesus grew up in a carpenter's house. Peter was the seasoned fisherman. And so it'd be kind of ironic that Jesus would tell Peter what to do about fishing when Jesus wasn't a fisherman. But he said to him, "Put out into the water, the deep water, and let down your nets." Peter objected in a sense and said, "We worked hard all night and we caught nothing." But then you find this phrase. He said, "But I will do as you say and let down the nets." The NIV says, "Because you say so, I will do it." And what I see within that, in an attitude of one who is radically following Jesus, is one who comes to the place with regard to his master and his Lord and says, "You know what? Because you say it, I will." It is a belief in what Jesus says, and it is a commitment to trust him and to follow him. Even when human logic would say, "That's not right. That's not the right thing to do." Even when popular opinion would be, "No, that's not the right thing to do." Even when your own personal opinion is, that's contrary to everything that I'm thinking right now, yet, Lord, because you say it, I will. And that's radical, wouldn't you say? But I think that's what's involved. If we're individually and if we're corporately as a church, if we're going to look at what God says to us and our desire is to evaluate our own following of Jesus, then the first thing we must look at is we look at ourselves and we say, am I really trusting him to the fact that, Lord, if you say it or because you say it, I will do it. That's a trust in him. That's a complete reliance upon him and a dependence on him. You know what I believe? Because look at the text. What happened? He did exactly what Jesus said to do. They let down their nets, and what happened? They caught a catch of fish that they probably had never ever caught in that many at that time like that. And what happens is, when you follow what Jesus says and you do what he says to do, you experience only what God can bring about in your life. That's what happened to Peter. You think that'll happen in our lives? You think God is is waiting and wanting to do things in and through us that defy logic, that is contrary to what, humanly speaking, can be brought about, but that only God could do it, and He's waiting on you and me to say to Him, because you say it, I will do it. And then we step out in obedience, and we follow Him, and the result is we see God do things that we would never experience Him or see Him to do if we had not stepped out in obedience. Do you agree with that? I think so. The deal is, though, taking that step to believe what He says and to do it. I believe, personally for me, this whole thing of reading the book Radical and really seeking it gets really frustrating sometimes when following Jesus is just business as usual. You know what I mean? When our following Him is just the routine, it's just the normal, it's just what we can accomplish. It's according to our standard and our way, as contrasted with really stepping out and following Jesus, according to what He says. Believing Him and trusting Him to do what only He can do. And I believe the only way that happens is that we take on the mindset that says, Jesus, because you say it, I will. And then we follow Him. That's what's involved in radically following Jesus. And so our prayer ought to be, God, move me to that place. God, take me to that place in my walk with you where I'm willing to say, whatever you say to me, my response is, I will. I'll follow. You say, well, that's scary. Well, I think we can trust Jesus, right? I think we can depend on Him. I think He has, I start to say, our best interest. He has His glory at heart, but our best interest, our good is in that, even if it is something that is very difficult and is contrary to our own opinion or popular belief or logic. We can still trust Him. Will you take that as your mindset? I'm challenging you. Because you say so, Jesus, I will. Look at verse 8. It's the second detail. So this catch of fish happens. And as a result, Peter doesn't necessarily, he does not see Jesus as a master fisherman. He sees Him as a Lord. It's almost like it is a revelation to him that this man Jesus is not just, earlier he said, Master, because you say so, I will. Now he says, Lord, move away from me because I'm a sinful man. And so I believe radically following Jesus comes to the place where we are willing to confess our own sin, our own inadequacy, our own humanness, our own whatever, that we are not what He is, and we desperately need Him. And I think it does begin, it is a part of that is sin. And I don't believe this was a false humility on Peter's part. I believe it was a genuine confession of his own sinfulness. It reminds me of what you read in Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah went into the temple and he saw the Lord high and lifted up. And then he heard the call of God on his life. And you know what Isaiah said? He said, I'm a man of unclean lips and I live among unclean people. And God then cleansed him and made him ready to be used by Him. What I see within this is, listen to this, is if we do not deal with our own sin, then we will not follow Jesus in a radical way. Does that make sense? And I'm not talking about salvation. I just mean if there are things in our lives that we hold on to, hang on to, that are contrary to God, that would fit in that are sin, then the end result is we will not step out and follow Him in a way that is radical. It must be dealt with within our lives. Whether it is trust in ourselves, whether it is pride, whether it is whatever it is. But if God puts His finger on things in our lives that are contrary to Him, that are hindering us and slowing us down in our following Him, then our response is to deal with it just like Peter did. He said, Lord, move away from me. I am an unclean man. I am a sinful man. And in that act, I believe, is a way of his dealing with that. Paul said it like this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He said, I buffet my body and bring it into subjection so that after I have preached to others, I myself am not disqualified. The writer of Hebrews said in Hebrews chapter 12, he said, we're surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses. Therefore, let us lay aside the sin and every weight that entangles us and that slows us down in order that we might run with endurance the race that is set before us. But it is the acknowledgement that God, if there's anything in my life that is hindering, that is slowing me down, that is tripping me up, that is keeping me back, then God, may I deal with it before you so that I now might run the race with endurance and perseverance that is set before me. We're going to follow Him, follow Jesus. That's part of what He meant when He said, if you're coming after me, deny yourself. Take up your cross. It is a diligently dealing with stuff in our lives. Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 2, he says, in a house there are vessels of honor and dishonor. He said, if a man cleanses himself of that which is dishonorable, meaning that which is sin, if a man cleanses himself of that, then he will be a vessel that is useful to God, prepared for every good work. But that usefulness and that being prepared comes about as we deal with the stuff in our lives that needs to be dealt with. My question to myself and to you, is there anything in our lives that is hindering, that is slowing us down, that is tripping us up, that we are hanging on to, that is keeping us from following Jesus in a way that is radical, that ultimately says, because you say so, I will? Obviously, that's something we deal with before God. And a verse that I've mentioned many times in Psalm 139 where He says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. And see if there is any wicked way in me, and then lead me in the way everlasting. We need to have that mindset that says, because you say so, I will. That surrender to Him, that obedience to Him. We need to be willing to confess our own sinfulness and to be done with that. And I realize that the lifelong process of sanctification in our lives as believers is ongoing. We're always dealing with stuff that God is bringing to our attention. But what I'm referring to is decisively, whatever God shows us is decisively dealing with it so that nothing slows us down and holds us back. And again, it is amazing to me how as Christians we can become so comfortable with sin in our lives that we don't see things as a big deal. But the reality is that those things may be the very thing that is hindering us in ways that keeps us from going on with God and following Jesus in a way that is radical. And therefore, we deal with it. We deal with it before God. Look at verse 11. You find the third truth there. It says that when they had brought their boats to the land, they left everything and they followed Him. Look at in Luke chapter 5 and verse 27. It says, and after he, referring to Jesus, after he went out, he noticed a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, follow me. Verse 28. And he left everything behind and got up and began to follow Him. In Matthew's Gospel, in Matthew chapter 4, similar setting to what we read in Luke chapter 5, Matthew records that James and John were present as well in that area where Jesus said to Peter, follow me. And then He said to James and John, follow me. And Matthew records and says that James and John left their boats and their father and they followed Jesus. That's radical, is it not? You know what that describes to me? And even here what he says in verse 11 in Luke 5, that when they got back to the shore, they brought their boats to land and they left everything and they followed Him. I want to resist the urge to soften that and to compromise it and to say, well, he didn't really mean that. But do you believe he really meant it? Yeah, but no. He They really did. And you know what? Peter was married. And we don't know all the details of how all that worked in. You say, how do you know he was married? Well, just prior to this, Jesus had healed his mother-in-law. You don't have a mother-in-law unless you have a wife. I mean, nobody. Well, you just don't. So how does that work in? I mean, how do you leave everything? And that boat represented his livelihood. It was his life. It was his income. It was his reputation. It was everything about him was tied in that boat, in his occupation. And it says, in this encounter with Jesus, it says he left everything and he followed him. That's radical. Again, I don't know all the details of what it looked like. What I do know is this. I do know that it was a complete surrender of himself to the one who said, follow me, his willingness to follow him. And it was whatever you say, Lord, I'm going to follow you. I'm remembering a time in my own life when alone with God, for a major thing that was happening in my life, I said, God, I have no clue how all these things are going to work out. And in my heart of hearts, I heard God say to me, you trust me, and I'll take care of all the details. And I believe that when Peter left to follow everything, I have to believe that in his heart of hearts it was, I'm following you, and Jesus would say, yeah, and I'm going to take care of all the details of your life. Because we can trust him to do that. You see, it's surrender. All to Jesus, I surrender. Man, that's easy to sing, isn't it? All to Jesus, I surrender. All to him, I freely give. That was what Peter was singing. That's what he was saying in Matthew and James and John. My career, I surrender to you. I'm going to follow you. Whatever that looks like, I'm following you. My family, I'm following you, but I'm entrusting everything about my family to you. But I'm following you. My life personally, everything, my wants, my wishes, it's yours, Jesus. I'm following you, you alone. And I surrender all of this to you. I'm going to trust it all into your hands. And we'll trust that you're going to work out all those details, whatever that looks like. All I know is you said, follow me, and my response is, I'm following you. Because you say it, I will. I'm going to trust you in the process. That's radical. Every detail of our lives to him and him alone. And we follow him. It's challenging, isn't it? I'm sitting here looking at your faces and I'm thinking, I'm thinking about myself. But I'm trying to look at you thinking, how are they processing all this? See, that's the thing is, remember last week, the words of Jesus, if any man come after me, let him deny himself, that it wasn't as a group, it was personally, individually to each one of us. And so we have to take it. So what represents my boat that I bring to land and say, I'm leaving it, and I'm following you? What is yours? What does that look like? That I'm going to have the mindset that says, because you say it, I will. That I will radically deal with sin in my life so that nothing hinders. And my response is that I will follow you and you alone. That's the heart of the matter. That's the heart of the matter. In the book Radical, and we talked about this on Wednesday night, the very last chapter, David Platt he calls it the year-long experiment. And he challenges those who read the book and get to chapter 9. He challenges them. And I've challenged our church, and I'm challenging you today to do that. And we'll elaborate on that more over time. But he challenges. He said, here's an experiment. Here's some practical things that are radical in following Jesus. You know what they are? Some of you do. It is to read the Bible through, the entire Bible through in a year. It is to pray for the entire world through the year. It is to give your money sacrificially to a gospel-centered cause. Give sacrificially to a gospel-centered cause. It is to get out of your present context and go to another context and serve God. It is to be an active part of a multiplying church, not just sitting on Sunday morning on a pew, but an active part of a multiplying church. And I look at those 5 things and I think absolutely. Those are actions every one of us could be involved in, right? Every one of us. Read the Bible, pray for the entire world, give sacrificially, get out of our context and go serve God somewhere else for a time, and actively be part of a local church. But you know what I'm reminded of? If those 3 things I just gave you from Luke 5 are not true in our hearts, you may start because the preacher says so, and with good intentions, but you will not go all the way to the end unless your attitude toward Jesus is, because you say it, I will, because recognizing and confessing the sin in our lives, and then being willing to say, I leave everything to follow you, and I trust you with that. See, that's the heart. And if we don't deal with the heart, we can talk about following Jesus radically till we're blue in the face, but actually doing it happens because our heart experiences a real change by God. And there's a point of decision that we make in following Him where we're willing to say, yes, I will deny myself. I will take up my cross daily, and I will follow you. And you know what the end result is? Do you know what the end result is? God will work in ways that will absolutely amaze us. We will see God do things in our lives personally and corporately in a church that we will, everyone, go away saying, only God. The only way that can be explained is that God did it. I want that, don't you? And I'm not satisfied with just marking time in our lives as believers, but have a willingness to see God do things. And I believe when we are following Him in a radical way, that what happens is we will see God work in ways that are only God. Only God. But you know what else will result? Satan will war against us. He hates it. We talked about this weeks ago when we began. The realization that the enemy of God despises when the church surrenders and follows Jesus in the way that He describes it. And Satan will war. Man, that ought to be a plus to us, right? The realization, man, if Satan is unleashing his attack on us individually and as a church, it ought to be an indication we're probably on the right path, doing the right thing, headed in the right direction. Because we're in direct conflict with Him. God will work mightily. Satan will war against us. But you know what the other part of that is? And this is the deal. Is that the world will come to know Jesus. They will see Him. They will see the glory of God in you, in me. And the result will be that people will become believers, will follow Christ because of what they see God doing as they see us following Him. I really wrestled because you know what I wanted. When I envisioned this day, I envisioned Elijah on Mount Carmel. Really. Man, I wanted thunder and lightning and the earth shaking and fire consuming a sacrifice and all of us bowing before God and saying, we will serve Him and follow Him and Him alone. That's what I wanted to see happen. But then I came to the Gospels and I watched Jesus. And He gathered disciples around Him. He just said, If you're going to follow me, deny yourself. Take up your cross. Follow me. There was no thunder. There was no lightning. The earth didn't shake. Fire didn't fall. He just said, this is it. After his resurrection, he gathered his disciples around him, and he said, they worshiped him. And he said to them, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. Go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I have commanded you. And I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. Now, granted, he was lifted up by their side. That's pretty amazing. But no thunder, no lightning, no earth shaking, no fire-consuming sacrifices. It was just, here it is. What you going to do? So we're challenged. Jesus says, let your nets down. What's that mean to you? Will your response be, you know what, Lord? Because you've said it, I will. As you encounter him, the realization is, oh, there's stuff in my life. You need to move away, Jesus. I'm a sinner. I'm a sinner. But our confession and our cleansing, being restored and made useful, and then being willing to say, I'm willing to leave it all and follow you. Is that your commitment? I'm challenging you.